what happens with your eyeballs and what I see, not only in how fast you're going, but in what you're seeing. And then the last terrifying thing when you have to sit in a car and you don't have that driver's ed brake in front of you is when they're switching lanes. Have you been through this? And Grant will just switch lanes. And, well, that's what he does in the computer games, so it works in driving. And on a busy freeway, at least in the Twin Cities, nowhere near, I pretend it's as busy as being out on the East Coast, but you could possibly hit a car by driving like that. So Mom and I started to coach him, like, there's certain things you need to do here, Grant. You have to look over your shoulder, check your window. You have 2 different windows that give you 2 slightly different angles. But you still got to check your blind spot, and you should probably do that a couple times. Oh, and use your signal. So he starts going through this routine, and that's just part of driver's ed. Most of what I just described is manual. So when he took driver's ed, it didn't tell him necessarily to be tuning into this big, huge, wide spectrum. Nor did it really kind of operationalize switching lanes in a variety of different ways. You know, it'll say check your blind spot, but it doesn't go through it like you do when you're in that car with them. So it started to occur to me that there's something going on as to what he's seeing as an inexperienced driver to what I have to offer as a teacher. And what I have to offer as a teacher at some level is how to see the world and how to see the kinds of things I see, not only for the hazards that are out there, but for the good stuff, like speeding, right? So those are the kinds of things that I want to be able to share with my son and go through with my son. In the same way as a teacher, we're going to kind of end today with Pokemon Go, is that we have something to offer our students. And it has something to do with how we see the world, and as an adult, the ways in which we can see the world or add layers of meaning to the world that are kind of essential. So I want to walk through some of those things with you and talk about that. First of all, though, the elephant in the room is this thing called Pokemon Go, right? How many of you have played Pokemon Go? How many of you are playing it now? All right. That's a lot of people. So there were still some people in the room that haven't yet, so I'm going to give you just a quick breakdown. It's a fairly simple game, so it's hard to describe to you. You basically have a map of the world that looks a little more dressy than Google Maps, right? And you've identified yourself on the map. So if we're talking about what I would call an AR game or an augmented reality game, generally speaking, these games are played on kind of a map, or you're dealing with spatial issues, which as a former geography teacher, I love this, right? So just play on a map and have fun with that, and we're moving towards class goals. Then you see things on your map, and this happens within the first 5 minutes of play, because they want you to learn the basic mechanics of the game, or how the game gets played, right? So you see little doodads on the map that have various names. You walk up to them, it uses the camera in the phone, and it puts that thing, you know, on your spouse's head, or on, you know, on the kitchen table, or anywhere. So you can find these things. And then you throw them the little ball, which is called a, thank you, and that little ball traps them in some way, and they become part of your stable of critters. Now, this is similar to Pokemon, the card game, where you would have critters that you play. The other person that you're playing with plays their critters, and your critters grow over the course of the game, and the same thing's true in this game. You find gyms after you've leveled up a little bit, and these gyms become a place where you can compete or challenge or take on tougher challenges. Now, obviously, there's good things about this if we want to look at direct education. Like, you start to see the full-on geeks, like measuring the different moves. So for those of you that play, this would be an extremely handy chart. These are your top moves, and these are the ones that people have figured out the math as to, like, how they're working, what the damage window looks like, where you need to be at, and DPS, which is the far less common, damage per second, which is the golden number in most of these kinds of games where you compete. So you want to start looking at these. Now, as a math teacher, you like that people are building charts for fun, and they're doing basic math, but I want to look at something a little different. I want to look at how it's used in education. And another example of this, obviously, is a week ago, the University of Idaho announced, well, they're going to have a whole class semester that's based on Pokemon Go. Really? What kind of class is that? So you get into this a little bit. You look at the University of Idaho, and sure enough, it's a physical wellness for life class, like getting out into the world and doing this. So this is great. So this is for a long time. One of the chief critiques of games in education is, well, my kid's just looking at a screen, and they're just sitting there getting very large, and I want them to move around the world. So here's the solution. Here's a game where they're moving around the world, and then the next thing you get is, well, there's problems with that too. Now they're not tuned in. Well, those older people like myself have watched middle schoolers be not tuned in for years. So I think it's a miracle most of them make it to high school. So the other piece of that is that as of a few days ago, USA Today reported there were over 75 million downloads. This makes it bigger than Pinterest, Twitter, Snapchat, all of those. And it's approaching to be one of the top, not just a mobile download, but it's approaching the numbers that would be one of the top games ever. Why? Just running around catching little critters and competing with each other and doing that? Yeah, it's pretty cool. So if you haven't tried it, it'll be there. It'll also be something that spawns tons more games like this. Because when there's that number of people, and it connects to a few advertisers here and there, you're going to see some spin-offs. Like we saw that with Minecraft, right? It was a big game, millions of people. Now there's tons of construction games out there. For those of us that like using these things in our classrooms, this is the golden age of educational gaming. So expect to see more games like this that aren't necessarily using little critters from a card game, but might be using other things. So I want to show you some examples of what that looks like today. But first, let's get to the critics. Pokemon has been in the news the last few weeks, right? Overwhelmingly, are we seeing positive news stories or negative news stories? So this is a phenomena that can get you really scared, because if they can scare you in the news, they will. If it bleeds, it leads, right? So anything where you're connecting something with 75 million people and something they should be concerned with, it makes for news stories. I want to, before we dig into this, because some of you might be seething on these negative stories right now, I'm not surprised by them at all. Like we saw this with comic books in the 80s. We saw it with rock music in the 50s. We saw it with texting, where whenever youth have a space that they enjoy that's a little bit wild and they control it, the adults that aren't familiar with that get upset. And they want to know what's wrong with these spaces. So let me show you just a few of these little pieces. First of all, you may not know, but somebody was playing Pokemon Go while driving their car. Thankfully, this was not my son. And they crashed into his school. What you get when you read the small print is no one was injured. However, they shouldn't be driving into school, right? You also see that there was a man who allegedly enticed a teen for sex playing Pokemon Go. What they don't say in the headline is that it wasn't actually Pokemon Go. It was an ad that the person would have to click on from Pokemon Go. So we're talking about basic internet safety and security things that kids should learn. And the other piece that we're finding out is that it wasn't actually someone trying to do this. It was the police setting up a sting to try to catch somebody. So it was very intentional. Man fell off a cliff playing Pokemon Go. Frankly, I think this one's just funny. It'd be not so funny if they died or got hurt, but can you imagine playing Pokemon Go at a park and then walking off a cliff? I can't. You really have to be tuned out. So then I started to ask the question, well, how many people are there that are tuned out in life and they get into accidents? So I started to try to find this information with the State Department. It turns out that we have, far prior to Pokemon Go, started to track pedestrian, let's cut off the top just a little bit. These are pedestrians walking around that die because they get hit by a car. They're not tuned in and something happens. Primarily, these happen in highly populated areas where you have cars and people in the same space. Look at the number in the second column. Those pedestrian fatalities seem to be a fairly constant number. Now, if that number skyrockets to 20,000 next year, we can blame Pokemon Go. But I have a feeling it won't. What's going to happen is that you just generally have right around 4,700 people that are so tuned out they get dead. And it's just a percentage of the population. And it's always been that way. So even if before Pokemon Go I had 4,735 stories that I could put on my news broadcast about people that get killed while they're walking, and we have 75 million people playing Pokemon Go, and none of them have died yet. But they will. It's just a matter of math. Someone is going to get dead while they're playing Pokemon Go. And it's going to happen, and it'll be leading news somewhere, and they'll blame the game, not the tuned out kid. Or to be blunt, they're a little bit of a dingbat, right? But there's always been dingbats. Even if you're riding a passenger bus, or you're in a vehicle, there is a certain number of people that die riding buses every year. And it happens to be right around 1/100th%. So if you ever ride any sort of passenger vehicle, train, bus, whatever, you have a 1/100th% of chance of dying in the given year that you ride that vehicle. It's just numbers. Insurance people love these numbers because it's how they run their business. I don't want to live by that 1/100th% of fear. I really want to be the other 99.99% that go ride a bus when I need to ride a bus. The number's fairly constant for motorcycles, right? We hear a lot of bad things about motorcycles, especially in the 60s. Look at that number. It's roughly, out of all registered motorcycle users, in a given year, about 4,500 of them will die. And that number has stayed fairly constant since 2005, at least on this chart. The injuries are a little higher, but essentially, that's not much higher than riding a passenger bus. There's a certain number of people in the universe that are so tuned out they hit things, right? You might be one of them, and at some point in your life you've done that. Here's the stunning thing, for me at least. You would think with texting that this is cars, right? Motor vehicle crashes as a cause of death in the United States. But that drop, think motorcycle death accidents would increase with the increase of cell phone and mobile use, but the reality is they have not. Other variables are at play. We're talking about a very complex society and complex world. The auto manufacturers like to brave that they're making safer cars with better braking systems, right? I'd like to think we have more attentive people, that maybe the Department of Transportation is building better intersections, right? Have you seen those little circly things? They're annoying as heck, but they statistically have less accidents than streetlights do. So it could be that we're building better roads. It could be that texting helps us drive better. We have no idea, and that's the idea, at least in my world of research. I want to know why something's happening before I make it lead in the news, right? So I hope that was kind of fun. By the way, that's right around 35,000 people a year in the U.S. die from automobile accidents every year. That's still a tragic number, and you have someone in your life that's died in a car accident, and that's a horrible thing. We want to see that go away. But that's a thing that's in a very complex system. Putting it all together, you're far more at risk driving a car, riding in a passenger bus, or riding a motorcycle than you are being a pedestrian. However, let's watch the numbers and see what happens with the increase in these games. What I've seen has been very different. Over the last 10 years, I've been working on these kinds of augmented reality games and playing around with them. And we've seen some things in that time. I want to talk a little bit about layered learning. When we start looking at the world around us, we can see different things. So right now, I could look out and see an audience in the room, or I could see teachers in the room, or I could see an orchestra, and we could start doing music together. It depends on what's going on and what we're doing as a group of humans. So layering activity is easy to do. People take walks all the time, but what if that walk became somewhat more useful for our learning? And how do we do that? I can have students come into my classroom and sit and read all hour, or I can do activities with them, or I can do projects, or we can watch a movie. There are varying levels of benefit to those kinds of things, and they all have certain benefits and certain drawbacks. So when it comes to going for a walk, is there this thing when we add technology into that mix? Can we make that walk different as an experience as educators? And the answer is absolutely. So let me take you back to history a little bit. And I hope that you get as excited about this as I do, because Pokemon Go, for those of us that have been doing augmented reality, all we can do is sit back and say, finally, they're using these devices the way they were meant to be used, right? So here's where this all started, and to give credit where credit is due. Eric Klopfer and Kurt Squire, back in the day, started looking at mobile devices in their infancy, and they started to think, wow, this technology has affordances that desktop computers don't have. Basic things like, these are mobile. These are GPS connected. These have motion sensors and gyrometers. And we can use all of these things together to be a much different experience than playing a regular computer game on a console or on a computer. More than that, these are not just television sets, but they can be. This was before they even had the digital screens where you can watch video. But they kind of prophetically saw this all coming, and which is why you got to look at it. At MIT, they started building an editor called MIT AR MITAR, which is MIT Augmented Reality. And they started to build these really hokey-looking products. This doesn't look anywhere near as nice as Pokemon Go, does it? These are the pilot prototypes that you can use a map, and you can put objects on the map, and people actually enjoy doing these things. So they started testing this. The problem with MyTAR was that you had to program the whole game. So if you wanted to make a change to it or tweak it, you had to send your request into MIT, and they would change your game when they got around to it, and then mail you your new game back. So when we started doing pilot prototype testing at the University of Wisconsin, we had a very slow process of getting those messages back and forth. However, the games were amazing. We started trying them out with science classes, middle school science classes. We'd bus the kids down to the park, Lake Wingra to be specific, and this is where I started hanging out with these folks. And they would play these games on these kind of devices that had preloaded the software, which made the setup really hard. And the kids would run around and they would talk to digital scientists and digital developers, and they would get all the stakeholders around this. They're trying to build an exhibit at the lake, or a apartment complex at the lake that had like a park with it. And they started to weigh out the ecological benefits and drawbacks of building that kind of thing on the middle of your lake, and how will that affect the lake. So they would go back to the classroom and start unpacking all the data that they found out, because all the students had talked to different digital people. And the teachers that we interviewed afterwards absolutely loved this. They said it was one of the best things they'd ever done in their class, because it was taking their students out into the world, bringing real problems back into their classroom, and they could replicate it year after year. So they didn't have to do all the work over and over again. So we said, oh, that's great. So are you going to do this next year? The teachers would say, oh, we wouldn't do this next. Well, why not? Well, because you come in with an army of grad students and help me on this whole thing. And you have all the devices set up. There's no way I can do all that on my own. So we ran into some roadblocks because the basic setup was really tough. But the reality was, we found out that we could bring people to real-world spaces, and we could layer something on top of it. So instead of just looking at a shop, we could have them talk to the shop owner, bothering the shop owner. That was amazing. We can layer an experience on top of the real world. So what kind of opportunities does that open up for us? And if you think about Pokemon Go, you have essentially that happening. They're layering a game experience on top of what we see every day. So they're making use of what is still probably the best resolution we have, despite what Apple says. Our eyeballs are amazing graphics processors. So if I can use that graphics processor with a game mechanic on top of it, I can use all the benefits and motivational strategies that the game folks have figured out, and I can start building meaning in those places. I can layer something on top of it. To me, that's kind of interesting. So I started guinea pigging my own kids. So this is my wonderful family. The most attentive person here is the dog. And that's still the case. He's a good dog, too. Where's Peggy? I threw my dog in there just for you. Is she around? Okay, there you go. So we started testing these kinds of things, and initially we started trying to work with the MyTAR engine, but then we started to build our own little editor because we wanted to do rapid prototyping. We wanted the ability to make a game in a few hours that we could go to the park and test. And then we started running into all other sorts of problems, like battery life wasn't very good. It's still not very good, right? Then we started running into other things like cell phone connections. We built an entire game at the Wisconsin State Capitol only to find out that they had locked down the Wi-Fi for security reasons. It's pretty hard to play your game. But because we rapid prototyped that game, we didn't lose that much. We hadn't spent a year building this thing. And lo and behold, with no advertising, no marketing, none of that, we saw almost 4,000 people up making their own augmented reality games. Most of them were teachers building things for their field trips, right? So I want my students to do this, and teachers doing things around the classroom. Well, this became interesting. The other thing we ran into was, at the time, cell phones were outlawed in most of our Wisconsin schools. One school had even set up a little detector that as you walk, any of you go to schools like that? That could detect the connection as students walked into the building. So at that time, educators saw cell phones and mobile devices primarily as tools of distraction. And yes, they are. Let's just admit that. But we all, as we move from childhood to adult, we have always had to teach kids to focus. For those of you that have lived prior to cell phones in our lives, I had a notebook, and I passed notes to my friends, right? And at some point, I got in trouble for that, and a teacher had to tell me not to pass notes in class. That stopped me? Well, I just got better secret, right? And students still do that. You can get them in trouble for texting each other, but they're still going to do it, and they're just going to get better at being sneaky about it. Or they'll get their parents to storm down the school and say, give my kid his phone back because I need to call them to pick them up after soccer practice, right? So schools started to mess with that. So as we started talking with administrators and having these conversations. Why are you outlawing walking in encyclopedias, allowing tools of information into your classroom? Well, because of porn, right? So we had to talk a little bit about that. Well, could we just train students to be responsible? And could we just let them know that maybe we can see everything they're doing? Because that eliminates because students think I'm on your Wi-Fi network. You could technically what I'm looking at, and yes, the IT people theoretically can do that. Do they actually sit and watch that? No. But a lot of times with students, that's all they need to know is that you can. And that keeps things fairly locked down. The other solution is to have your own devices. So schools started buying Chromebooks, iPads, and then they could lock down their own devices. And that solved a lot of these problems. All of this is building towards a world where 75 million people are playing Pokemon Go. Because we started to publish these results, right? We found out to test these, students will be distracted ideas. We just gave a group of students that their families had not let them have a mobile device before, and we gave it to them, and we started just watching everything they did for 2 weeks. Because we wanted to know, is this a major distraction? Will their grades go down? Will they stop turning in homework? Will the world explode when this happens? And our hypothesis is that it wouldn't, and sure enough it didn't, but we started to see some really surprising things. One, as these kids had the phones and we kept interviewing them, we noticed that it amplified their sense of agency. And we started to see little anecdotal stories that weren't so anecdotal because they kept popping up, where students would say, oh yeah, I feel like I'm more competent now. And it was this Swiss Army knife thing. I can do anything. One young man their parents got lost on the way to the airport, and the young man pulled out the research phone that we had given him and started looking up the map directions. And suddenly he became a useful member of that car. Not like my son when he drives. We're still working on that. But he was able to give instructions where he wouldn't have been before because he had access to information. So we started to see stories happen with almost all of the people from age 8 to 18 that participated in the study. We started to see that kind of piece happening. We also started to look at amplification of interests. Students already had existing interests, and they started to go to their phones to amplify them. Like a young man that played guitar, when we looked at his phone after only 2 weeks, he had 8 different guitar apps on his phone. He went out searching for them, and he found them, and then he started recording his music because he could have his own digital backup band when he did this. Well, that's interesting, that those interests could be amplified with a simple tool on the device. So the interests would go up a little bit. We also saw activation of learning. Though the students were still good at hiding them because they went to schools where they weren't allowed, they were still able to go up and help their teacher find things. Like, hey, the British made 6 different kinds of ships in that era because they could look things up in that little pose under their desk, right? And they could do that. They also started making great judgment calls because no one told them the ethics, the norms, and the cultural behavior around mobile devices. So they started considering things like, should I bring this with as we go outside on this field trip? And a lot of the students would consider things like, if I bring it with, I have a chance of breaking it, and I don't want to break it, so I might leave it in my locker, but then I can't look things up or take pictures. And they started working out these questions that we hadn't taught them or encouraged them to think through. And they made largely good decisions as to how they use those kinds of things. So we started to see that. And the most surprising thing was that it highly amplified the social systems. And this was almost, if you remember, and things like that. I'm a researcher now, so I'm okay to say I was kind of a geek when I was a kid. I still am. I'll admit it. But kids felt like they could connect with their friends better when they had the mobile device because kids would plan what was happening online. And if they weren't involved in that, they were the last to know that something was happening. Well, when we gave them phones, they started to report things like, finally I can tune into what's going on, and I can actually get to events and talk to people. So I feel like I'm part of the in crowd, which is why kids get really desperate to get these devices because they can see that and they can do it. Well, we're in a different era now where those things aren't as surprising. At the end of the day, play is amazing. And these consider a waste of time, extremely valuable in things like learning, social development, amplifying your interests and what you're interested in, and even that sense of agency. If I'm competent in this game, maybe I can be competent in real life. The kids have always played, even before digital devices, and play has always been a mechanic for these kinds of things. So when you see phones coming into that space, mobile devices coming into that space, iPads coming into that space, where they're part of the play life of a child, that becomes a really interesting thing to study. And of course, we try to keep neutrality. I'm not saying that's good or that's bad. And there will be a certain percentage of those kids that are so tuned out they'll get hurt. But that's always been the case. In fact, at one point I looked at like how many people get hurt because sidewalks aren't well kept. And there's a lot of people that skin their knees on sidewalks, especially if they're next to a playground. I'll switch gears a little bit. All of this leads up to this idea that as educators, we can renew or make new the meaning of a space. So I remember when I was young, I went with my grandma and grandpa took me for a summer so my dad could go back and get his certification credits for teaching. So I got to stay with the grandparents for a month in the summer. And every weekend, Grandma would get in a car and she would insist that we go to these historical sites all over North Dakota. And they all looked the same. It was a big flat piece of land where something happened. And if you're from North Dakota, you take pride in that. Well, darn, yeah, we respect these historic sites. And they generally were about things that were like a little bit uncomfortable, like here's where we slaughtered 3,000 Native Americans. And so there were these really kind of there too. But my grandma would go to these sites and there would be inevitably there was some state of North Dakota plaque there, and she would read the whole plaque. And as kids, we had to sit and listen to that plaque. Some of you are laughing. You have a grandma like this? Because it was good for us to hear this. And what she was trying to do, as an adult, I see what she was trying to do. As a middle schooler, I was like, can we go now? Because I can see corn. But as an adult, she was trying to renew the meaning of that space. She was trying to help me to see that things had happened before I got there, that I wasn't the center of the world, that there's a whole big world out there and things that have happened and people that have fought and died to make my life happen the way it has. And I should be appreciative of those things. So she wanted to renew the meaning of these spaces. And over time, I think she was fairly successful. It stuck with me, but at the time, it was a little tough. So what does it look like if at the time, we could start to renew meaning in a way that kids were a lot more interested in it? I'm talking about, Pikachu, right? I'm talking about these spaces that are rich with history that we can layer meaning on top of, and we can renew that space to some extent. So these are some of the earlier games we did where we watched the movie National Treasure, and we built a treasure hunt-like game at the Wisconsin State Capitol. This is the one that broke on us. So, and as a good educator, we had little brown bags and pieces of paper and note cards. We did the same game. So nothing I'm talking about requires you to be a programmer. It requires you to think about space as a place where you can play as a teacher, and you got to think about proctoring that space. How do we do a field trip? Well, teachers, museums, you're the people that know how to do field trips. You're the most ready to make these games audience that I'll talk to this year, except for maybe librarians. They're pretty good at this too. Jim Matthews built a game where he was taking high school students to the exact same space, but he didn't renew meaning in the historical world. He renewed meaning in the protests that were happening at the Capitol. Capture these things so that in generations they can see what happened at this Capitol. So he had his students down with just basic video cameras in their phone, capturing these videos and then placing them into an augmented reality game so you could go reenact or see those events in that space later on. This is a lot like when you go to the National Mall and there's the Martin Luther King plaque on the stair, that you step there and you imagine that little video you've seen. But this is the spot where that happened, and clearly the mall's not full of people when you stand there, but you can imagine that it's like that. So basically, Jim wanted that experience for students. Other interesting things started to happen. This is a Spanish teacher in New Mexico that started taking neighborhoods where it was Spanish-only neighborhoods, and he used an augmented reality game, that map with little